Sure you get a handout? Okay, we are live on the air, so it is time to begin. Let's open with a word of prayer. Our gracious Father, once again, we just marvel at your exceeding abundant goodness to us on a daily basis. We thank you for the refreshment you have given to us. We thank you for the way you care for your garden and just for the precipitation we've had here in these last couple days. And pray that you will water our souls in an abundant way and nurture us and feed us and teach us and lead us. Help us to be pliable in your hands, to always want to do what you tell us to do, even when sometimes it might not seem to make all that much sense. Help us to learn a lesson from what we're studying here in Sunday school and to walk by faith and not by sight, and to allow these heroes of the Old Testament days to teach us the lessons we need to learn. Do pray for your provision as the word goes forth around the world today, that you will empower your servants to faithfully communicate the truth. We thank you we can trust the Spirit to work. We thank you for an authoritative Word of God that we do have to study and to proclaim. So we're looking forward to hearing of great results all over as this matchless message goes forth. But we need your blessing here, and we plead for help now in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, you can turn in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. And we are examining in this current series heroes of the faith in the Old Testament. Today we come to Hebrews chapter 11, verses 30 to 32. We're talking about people in this hall of fame of faith and using them as our guide. And with the examples that the writer has set before us today, we come to a new time period in Israel's history, and this is what we call the conquest and division of the land. So at the top of your handout, you again have a timeline, so you know that this is an official Sunday school class because you're getting a timeline, so you're getting your money's worth whether you know it or not. But just remember where we've come from, 1446, last time when we talked about the Passover and sprinkling of blood, and then the event at the Red Sea where God marvelously delivered them. That was back here, 1446. Then we have the 40 years of the wilderness wandering, and there are no examples from Hebrews 11 concerning the wilderness wandering. Any quick reaction or response why that's probably true? There aren't any? There weren't any heroes. It was not known basically as a time of spiritual giants as far as trusting God and believing God. And that doesn't mean there weren't a few individuals, etc. But yeah, by and large, that was a time of unbelief. So now today we come to following 1406, and this begins this next major period in Old Testament history that we call the conquest and division of the land. They came in 1406, and as you see on your sheet, 1050 is a generally accepted date for the beginning of the reign of King Saul. Okay? So that's how we get those markers. It's not just I was rolling dice this week and said, oh, okay, came out to this, let's put this date on the sheet. Now, I did roll dice, not really, but, well, I did roll dice playing a game with my grandchildren, I guess, okay? And it was a game of luck. That's why I didn't win and so on. But when it comes to some of the other dates you see on your sheet, and we'll get to this a little bit more, but there are question marks by them because we don't have definitive things in one sense that can really nail things down quite the same as these other dates that are standard dates. And so I actually gave you a couple of I wouldn't say options, but just so you see that even amongst conservative Old Testament scholars, there is a difference. So generally, about 1390, the date for the death of Joshua is pretty settled in one sense, and I won't go into the reasons for it here. But then when we come to the four judges that the writer of Hebrews uses, you see on the timeline, I put 1240 to 1200, roughly the time for Deborah and Barak. But if you look in the parentheses right below, I give Leon Wood's date And he says it was maybe closer to 1209 to 1169. And of course, Whitcomb, you're familiar with Whitcomb from the famous duo, Whitcomb and Morris. This is the John Whitcomb who taught at Grace Theological Seminary for all those years. He was a conservative Old Testament scholar. And Leon Wood, who was alive at the same time and ministering at a seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He's also a conservative he was a conservative Old Testament scholar, and his dates differ a little. So I just gave you the shall we say, possible options, so you realize when we get to some of this, as far as nailing down the precise year, like we can basically for these other things, there's going to be fluctuation even in the midst with conservatives. Now, if you find somebody dating these individuals, like the Exodus was in the 1200s, well, yeah, put a capital L by their name for liberal, and say they have a right to be wrong if they want to, but they're definitely not following the biblical understanding. Okay, so you see that, but the key is we're entering into this period of time called conquest and division. Now, as the Israelites cross into Canaan, they are, of course, going to be facing some very formidable foes and some very formidable cities. So when you think of our map, they were down here in Egypt 430 years, 1876 to 1446. They came out and God led them south to go north, because when they came north, they refused to go in when He said. For 40 years they wandered in the wilderness, and finally at 1406 they came here, getting ready to enter from the eastern part of the Jordan River. And this is where the book of Deuteronomy takes place, as they're on the banks. And then, of course, we have the book of Joshua. And so as we look at some of these individuals today, we are now at this point in Israel's history, and this is where it is located on a map. And of course, when you think of it, remember, you have all these Canaanite enclaves, if you will, these Canaanite city-states located all over here. And so as Israel comes in, we're talking about very formidable enemies. So this really is going to be a big deal. It's not just a matter of, oh yeah, we bought a house in that neighborhood, no problem moving in, etc. No, this is a big deal, as we will see. So God has been preparing them. I mean, think of all the miracles they saw down here in Egypt. Think of the miracles they saw down here in the wilderness. And all those were actually not just a matter of, been there, done that, but it was, what lesson have you people learned from God's powerful hand on display in your history in the past? Because you're going to need to call on those miracles, or recall those miracles, shall we say, if you're really going to be able to have the faith to go in and do what you need to do. So if they thought that, shall we say, the worst part of their life was over, worst part in the sense of, being challenged by their faith, they ain't seen nothing yet. Because now that they come into the land, they are really going to need to exercise faith and say, remember what Hebrews 11:1 says? Faith is the assurance or conviction that what God says can be banked upon, because He knows what He's talking about. And number two, it's being able to see things that are unseen. And we're going to see that so very graphically displayed today with his examples. So what is the notable absence here is we do not find Joshua's name. Let's go ahead and read our text, chapter 11, verse 30. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. And what shall I more say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah. Okay? So, so it could be that, like I say, it's kind of notable that it doesn't say by faith Joshua conquered Jericho. But it uses the plural, by faith they circled around, etc. So maybe the emphasis, the sly emphasis is the people were following the faith of Joshua, but as you just told me, this generation of people down here were known for their unbelief, and now the people, when they came to Jericho, the people as a corporate group could be characterized as having faith because they're following the faith of Joshua. Okay, so what method is God going to use to defeat Joshua? Well, this is very significant. Okay, for Israel, it will build their faith because we don't have any other examples prior to this that God performed a miracle to defeat an enemy in this particular fashion. Okay? So, remember, I gave you again a good definition for miracle. A miracle is a direct act of God's special revelation performed by God in the external world. This is not just something that happens in a closet and nobody sees it. No, this is right there for all to see. Contrary to the ordinary course of nature and designed to be an attestation or sign. Okay? In other words, when God performs a miracle, it's always meant to be like a signpost. Go this way 14 miles and you get to Layton. Go that way 6 miles and you get to the closest Sam's Club or whatever, okay? They're signposts. They are pointing to a destination. It is not just a, as I said before, oh, God did this, okay, that was nice, now let's move on. Every time He did that, it was, aha! Stop and think about that, and what lesson can I learn, because God is pointing to something greater than the event that just happened in front of our eyes. Okay? So, as they approach these unconquerable cities, it would thus remind them the method that God used at Jericho. It would remind them with every city that they approached, with God all things are possible. Because basically, you know, what Jericho's going to do is Jericho is just going to, like any of those ancient Near Eastern cities would do, if you had good fortified walls, you would basically just bring up your drawbridge, close everything up, and you would say, we have enough food, we have enough of everything that we are self-sustained and we can outweigh you. If you come and you camp around us, you're not going to conquer us, because we can just stay in here for 6 months, 9 months. We've got a big food supply or whatever. So we can outweigh you, and an army's not going to just sit there that long. They're going to have a different battle plan. So with God's battle plan of no fighting taking place, but the walls crumbling, can you imagine what that does if you're in any of these other cities and you think you have sufficient walls? Your walls aren't anything like Jericho's walls, and Jericho couldn't withstand them. So basically, the way God psychs them out is, they start to think, if we stay in our city like that, the walls could fall on us. So we've got to leave the city and fight them. And we're not studying the book of Joshua here, so we don't need to get into all this. But in the book of Joshua, you see God's various methods. So when they get to another city and immediately the people throw open the gates and go running out, God's battle plan for that city was, we will have people in hiding, so as soon as they get out of the city, the people in hiding go in, start burning the city, and smoke goes up, and then the people are out there and they are trapped between the Israelite army and that city. And now what do? And God's army defeated them. So now the next city is psyched out because they say, if we stay in our city, we're a piece of cake for them. If we leave our city, we are a piece of cake for them. What kind of battle plan can we come up with? So it doesn't matter how smart you were as a Canaanite general. I mean, you were just sweating, profusely, like, what kind of battle plan can you use against a God who has battle plans that we're not even familiar with? And to boot, He also has miracles in His pocket. So we're not just talking about multiplying military equipment. We're talking about how in the world do you fight against an omnipotent God. Okay? So that's why as Israel's going in, this method God's going to use here is great. Now, very, very quickly, as I put on your sheet, see Exodus 15, 14 to 16. And Bob, since Wilson wasn't here, so I couldn't ask him ahead of time, so Bob is going to model for us. Are you listening to this, Mark? So you see the model, the way to publicly... Okay, sitting. So Bob is going to read Exodus 15, 14 to 16. Now listen to the response of Canaan, because Exodus 15 occurred back here after Israel saw God's mighty work at the Red Sea. And when Miriam led the people in a victory song, this is what she said is going to happen concerning the mindset of the people in Canaan as Israel comes around and enters the land. Bob.
The people have heard, they tremble, pangs have seen the inhabitants of Philistia. Now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed, trembling seizes the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them. Because of the greatness of your arm, they are still as stone. So your people, O Lord, pass by. Till the people pass by whom you have heard.
Okay, and then we're not going to take a moment to go back and look at other Joshua references. But if you look at other Joshua references, as Israel came in and conquered the land, as they come to these individual cities, it is interesting how many of the words that are used in Exodus 15 are repeated in the book of Joshua when it says, the people of city X, fear took a hold upon them. They trembled, they were scared to death, they were psyched out. And 40 years before that, God said, of course, because they're going to realize they are facing a God who has so many weapons at His disposal, and they're just not going to know what they can do. So number one, the method God uses is going to be for Israel to encourage them, but it's also going to indeed be for the enemy cities, if you will. So when we think of this event then, and we can be real quick here because you're familiar with it, but as Israel crossed here, and they got to Jericho, remember what they did. They simply walked around. They had some of the people walk around the city one time. And then they went back to their tents for the day. And you can just imagine some of maybe the people in the city of Jericho looking out over the wall saying, whoa, look at those people. What are they doing? They're just circling our city. Ha, 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 good luck to you. Oh, they went back to their tents. The next day they came and they did the very same thing. What are they up to today? This is crazy. They're going to have to do that for months if they think they're going to defeat us. And then finally, the seventh day, they do it 7 times, and the walls come tumbling down. Anybody want to sing the song for us, Jericho, and the walls tumbling down? I see some head shaking you'd like to, but I don't want to hear you sing, so we'll maybe pass on, okay? But yeah, I mean, this is incredible. What kind of defense do you use? Doesn't matter how much food you have, doesn't matter how good your warriors are. What kind of defense do you use against that? There is none. There just absolutely is none. So, therefore, as I put on your sheet, just a couple of quotes to remind us how this really was a great act of faith on Israel's part. The encircling of Jericho for 7 days demanded a high quality of corporate faith, for it appeared to be so utterly futile to the pagan onlookers who had no concept of what God in His power could do. It took faith to carry out this mode of attack, which seemed to be no attack at all. It took faith in things not seen. Because, I mean, if you're an Israelite and God says, just walk around the city and don't worry, I will bring it down, you're saying, yeah, right. Do you know how good these walls are? They've been OSHA approved. They're every single year. They're checked out again by engineers. I mean, they are sufficient. But they weren't this time, Fred.
Royce, it reminds me of Deuteronomy that a couple of times God said, if you obey me, then I'll defeat all your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just that next first step where
Exactly.
they did exactly the stupid things, walking around there without doing anything, because God told them to do it that way.
That was the assurance. That was the assurance or conviction. Yep.
Later, of course, then they don't, and then Nebuchadnezzar comes in.
Right. Yep.
Imagine just the faith it took for all those people to walk around.
Right. Yeah, that's why I say it wasn't just Joshua who said, I believe God can do it, and the people said, but we don't think so. You walk around the city and we'll sit here and laugh at you. No, it took a corporate faith. They had to believe it. And God True to his self, came through. Okay, very familiar story, but you see why this is a great example. Why this is a great example for Hebrews 11. Verse 31 now, we come to the harlot Rahab. Okay, Rahab the harlot did not perish with the disobedient or the disbelievers, having received the spies with peace. Okay, this is truly amazing on multiple levels. For sure, number one, remember she is a Gentile or pagan. So this is a great Old Testament example that, shall we say, non-Israelites could be saved. They could be right with God. Secondly, she was a devotee of the Canaanite deities. I mean, she had been bred and buttered with the best, shall we say, of what Canaanite culture, etc., was all about. And she was the harlot. Specifically, the definite article is used. So she must have been pretty famous for that. And the term that's used basically would indicate she was what we would just call a secular harlot or prostitute. This wasn't like a religious or a temple prostitute. Now, I think, and by again saying I'm not alone in this, but I think when we think of Rahab's house, I think this basically would be, as I put on your sheet, the equivalent to today what we would talk about as it was pretty much like, shall we say, a hotel, a restaurant, a bar, all in one. Okay? And so, in other words, this was a great place for the spies to originally go. Because in a place like that, you have all sorts of people. You have a lot of loose talk because the liquid they're drinking has loosened them up and their morals, etc., are such that they're just talking about politics, who knows what. So if you're a spy, that's a great place to just sit there and be drinking your 7-Up with them and to be listening to what they're saying is the testimony of the people as they see the children of Israel coming into the land. So this was very, very ideal. Now, as it says here, her neighbors are characterized as being disbelievers. So again, that highlights the point we're trying to make of this is a great example of faith, because here you have this whole, should we say, everybody in the city is an unbeliever, a disbeliever in God. They have gotten in the boat with the Canaanite deities. And then here is this one woman who says, I want out of that boat because that boat's going to sink. They are losers, and I don't want to be a loser. I want to be on the winning team. And so she says, I am going to trust your God because, and she specifically says, people around here talk about, they realize what happened when you came out of Egypt and you came up here, all these miracles your God did. And she said, I think your God is stronger than our Canaanite deities. I want to be on the winning team. I want to get in the boat with you. Now that is an amazing confession of faith. And literally, she's putting her life on the line. Because you say, well, when she lies, what happens if the king finds out about it? Well, she put her life on the line for lying, but she put her life on the line for getting in the boat with the Lord's people. Because in so doing, she was turning her back on her Canaanite culture, her previous lifestyle, everything. And she was saying, I think your God is the one that I want. And so actually, and maybe we should read this back in Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2, verses 8 to 11 is what I think we can call her salvation testimony. In other words, just before she was baptized, this is what she said to the people who were there that day. For those of you who are here at our baptismal services, you know what I'm playing on there, okay? Before they were laid down, this is Joshua 2:8. Before they were laid down, that is the men, she came up unto them on the roof and said unto them, I know the Lord has given you the land, and your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. We heard what you did unto the two kings of the Amorites on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. She's referring to events here on the east side of the Jordan when Israel came up, and God miraculously defeated those two powerhouse kings. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts did melt, neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. Now get this. coming from a Gentile, cultured Canaanite prostitute, the Lord your God is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. Can I get in the boat with you? I trust your God. I don't trust my Canaanite deities. Is that faith or is that faith? Yeah. What an incredible example. So it's no wonder that the writer of Hebrews would include her. So I put on your sheet, for a woman of ill fame and a completely pagan upbringing to attain such a conviction concerning the one true God was a striking display of faith. She turned her back on her own people and the cultural tradition in which she had been reared to throw in her lot with the covenant nation of Israel. She literally risked her life for the cause of the Lord. Now, this story does bring up, however, another interesting point that we don't want to get too bogged down with, but we do need to, I think, address it. Did she lie when the king's men questioned her? Absolutely she did. Okay? So how in the world are we going to explain it? Well, there are various ways that people explain it, and so we're going to just touch on these so that we can think through things when maybe we try to justify things we do, and we try and act noble in the process, but really it's because we don't have faith, so we're not trusting that God can intercede. So number one, there are some say, well, yeah, she lied, but she was an unsaved Canaanite, so it was okay, because that was a cultural thing. They just lied. Remember, God condemns all lying. And I put just 3 verses out of scores of verses I could put on your sheet. Old Testament and New Testament. Book of Proverbs reminds us all lying is abominable to God. Paul in the New Testament, Ephesians 4, says, now that you are saved, one of the things you need to put off that was so characteristic of you as an unbeliever was your lying tongue. You need to put it off. You can't be known as liars anymore. So God says lying is a taboo, okay? So we can't explain it away by saying it was okay because of her cultural background. No, it wasn't. Number 2, situation ethics. Joseph Fletcher, back in the 50s, popularized this ethical theory where the specific situation will always determine the way you respond to it. So he said there are no absolutes. The only absolute is love. What do you think is the most loving thing in that situation? And he literally says in his books, sometimes you're going to be called upon to break every commandment that you think is there. But that can be the most loving thing you do, so that's what you should do. Okay? So a situation ethicist here would simply say, well, she did the most loving thing. That was okay for her to do. But the Word of God, again, has absolutes to it. The Word of God specifically says lying is always wrong. God doesn't say lying is wrong, but if, He says lying is wrong. Period on the end of the sentence. Number 3, the text clearly indicates she lies and is not condemned. For example, Hebrews 11:31 says she's a hero of the faith. James 2:25 praises her. So some people would say, how can you say her lies are wrong if it doesn't specifically say that she was wrong? Okay? Remember again, the Joshua account that does not, that indicates she lied but doesn't make any, shall we say, judgment on that lie. Remember, that is a narrative account that is simply describing something for it. It is not a prescriptive passage. You know the difference between descriptive passages and prescriptive passages? There are a lot of passages in the Bible that are descriptive. Simply says, here's the history, this is what took place, but it makes no comment on it at that time. So you have to go to prescriptive passages that comment on the descriptive passages. Number 4, the noble lie. It's okay to lie if it's for good purposes and good results from it. People have said that all throughout history. But Romans 3:8, speaking of that very thing, says, no. Should we do evil so good abounds? He says, no way. That's not a Christian way of looking at things. Or number 5, the greater good lie. well, she was doing the greater good, so yeah, she lied, but it was a greater good, and she was making this hierarchy of values. Put a quote here, Scripture nowhere advocates or allows for such hierarchy. Truth-telling is not only a covenantal responsibility, that is a responsibility to those who are part of the family of God, but it is a universal responsibility for all times, all peoples, in all places. We must not form our own subjective hierarchies or personal priorities in assigning what we believe is the greater good or the lesser evil. So did she lie? Yes. Was it okay to lie? Absolutely not. Should we lie? Absolutely not. But when you think of her background and you think of everything that was against her, I think we can simply say she just said, I know I got to get out of this boat and in this boat. And she just did what to her seemed like the best possible thing at the moment. And God wasn't saying, yes, go ahead, it's great for people to lie. He simply says what matters is she really had faith, even though she expressed it in a way that we might say seems a little strange here. Okay? So again, there's a lot more we could say, but I think that's sufficient here. But just to remind us that we don't go to examples like this and say, oh, it's okay for me to do this. Oh, it's okay for me to be unfaithful to my spouse because great men of God like David were. No. Can't have such ungodly reasoning. Okay? Can't do that. Hebrews 11:32. As we move on, Hebrews 11:32 says, "And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah." Okay? The writer here uses a rhetorical question as he tries to emphasize just how many more examples he could use. In other words, he's basically saying, oh my, I could keep going on and on with these examples if I want to, but time is limited, space is limited, so I'm going to have to just, shall we say, rein in the horses here. But I will talk about 6 more people individually. I will name 6 more people individually, and then I will give just some broad categories. And basically, in effect, to the reader, he's saying, it's up to you, the reader, to, as you read the Old Testament, find people who really did respond in faith these particular ways. Now, since the first 4 names are judges, and probably we don't immediately associate them with the word faith, let's take just a quick overview of the book of Judges as a stage setting, or look at the background, if you will, because I think this is really important if we're going to wrestle with how in the world did these judges exercise faith when you read their accounts, your first thought is, man, they did some pretty ungodly things. They didn't seem to be the kind of person you would hold up as an example, a good example to follow. Okay, remember, Israel has just spent 430 years in the wilderness, as we said. 430 years in Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, and our best guess is that Joshua died, somewhere around 1390. Okay? Joshua's death. So, as we come to the time of the judges now, we find a whole new generation. Joshua had been the leader, and it says when he died off, and basically his contemporary generation, all these people who had seen so many mighty works of God, we come to another generation that's going to assume leadership. But this new generation, they need to be godly people themselves. Remember, God has no grandchildren. Okay? So it's not like those people said, well, my grandpa was so godly, he was a preacher, and my dad was so godly, and my mom, you can't believe the godly home we had, and so, oh, but you're the new mom and dad. Now, what kind of people are you morally? What kind of people are you spiritually? And so, therefore, they had to buy into the covenant themselves. And sorry to say, most of them played fast and loose with God and the covenant. And that's why we have, during the period of the Judges, this, shall we say, this Wild West atmosphere of basically anything and everything going on. So, God's very specific command to Israel was, as they entered the promised land, He said, I want you to go to these Canaanite cities, and for these major cities, I want you to put them, we use the word, under the ban. And the ban was you simply go in and you basically wipe out everybody because they are so evil. And if you start associating with them and saying, hey, we're new, we're the new kid on the block. What do we need to do to have a good garden? What do we need to do to be a successful businessman? You are going to be led directly into Canaanite thinking, Canaanite culture, Canaanite lifestyle. And God says we can't have that. Plus, remember, it was also God's way of judging these Canaanite nations after He had given them literally, He had given them centuries of grace to turn to Him. And they didn't. Okay? So He said, you need to wipe them out. But this new generation that went in did not fully do what God basically told them to do. And as we might say today, they just kissed up with the Canaanites. And it was like, those are such nice people. And they this and they that and whatever. And all of a sudden they started acting, they started believing like a Canaanite, acting like a Canaanite, following Canaanite deities, totally, absolutely, totally contrary to everything that Yahweh stood for and that Yahweh's people were supposed to be like. And so therefore, with that kind of, shall we say, evil infiltration into their lives, it's no wonder they started, morally, things just totally fell apart, and all these incredibly abhorrent things we read in the book of Judges were happening. It was because they had turned from God and they bought into this entirely wicked lifestyle. Now, as I put on your sheet, just a few quick facts, concerning the book of Judges, because this is really important as well. First of all, key verses 17:6 and 21:25. Do you have those verses memorized? In those days there was no king in Israel. What a prosperous society they had. In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man, woman, and child did what was right in his own eyes. What a recipe for failure, okay? As we read the book, we encounter a cyclical pattern. This pattern of sin. The children of Israel would go into sin. So God would say, okay, you're being disobedient to me, so I'm going to bring you into slavery to a foreign nation, sin, servitude. After a while, the people said, oh, this is no fun. God, be gracious to us. And to show you just how gracious God was, He would say, okay, so sin, servitude, they supplicated God, and God would send them a Savior, or God would send them a deliverer, or as the book of Judges calls them, a judge. Okay? Or I put other terms that other writers use: rebellion, retribution, repentance, restoration, or rescue. They're all kind of alliterative just because it's easier to remember that way, okay? But that was the cycle. But it wasn't just a repetitive cycle. When we think of cycles, we might say the cycle just kind of continues like this. But the really sick thing is, this is a downward cycle. So as we progress from here to here, things are getting worse and worse. It is getting more evil. And again, you would just say, why didn't somebody wake up? Why doesn't somebody realize, when you start going here and say, wait a minute, look how we've dropped off a cliff. Look what's happening. But they didn't. Each generation never learned a lesson from the previous one. And as a result, things really got bad. So when God raised up, the next thing is, note the chronological note. Chapters 17 to 21, which are terribly abysmal. I mean, things happen there that a lot of liberals say, how can that be in the Bible? You shouldn't even have children reading that portion of the Bible. It is so bad with the things that happen. And that's true. It is wicked, but that's what happens when you turn your back on God. But chronologically, it seems that those events actually happened at the beginning of the Judges period. So we read the book of Judges and we come to chapters 17 to 21 and say, whoa, the bottom really fell out by the time we get here. But actually, these things were happening here, and it got even worse than that. And you can almost say, thank God he doesn't go into greater detail about some of the things that really happened if this was actually what was happening up here. And I gave you some evidence there where you can check it out. But specifically, like when you compare 18:1 with 134, you see the chronology. And specifically in chapter 18 and verse 30, speaking of Jonathan, the King James says, Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh. Now, if you have a more modern translation, like Legacy Standard Bible, I think NASB, etc., it says, Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses. And you say, oh, wait a minute. This guy was just like a grandson or a great-grandson of Moses. When did Moses die? He died way back here. So his great-grandson wasn't alive 350, 400 years later. It was happening right here. And you say, how in the world can we get from Manasseh to Moses? Okay, technically, you ready for a small point of Hebrew, should we say grammar here or whatever, so you can walk out and tell people, yeah, the Bible has tikkune sopharim in it, etc. A tikkune sopharim is simply a Hebrew expression that means a change by the scribes. Okay? And there are multiple places, 24, 36 or something, in the entire Old Testament, where when scribes were going through, they read something and they said, this is so bad, there is probably no way that could be true, so they altered the text a little bit. But they put a thing there so you can see what they did. You say, but how do you get from Manasseh in our English to Moses? Okay? The word Moses, looks like that in our Hebrew Bible. This is the equivalent of M, this is like an SH, and this is actually an H, but as it comes into English, we say Moses. Okay, if you look in your Hebrew text, the scribes put an N above this, so it's not right at the same level. They put it a little bit higher on the line, and all of a sudden now we have Manasseh. All they needed to do was make that one little change. A scribe made that one little change, and it changes the very name here. Okay, and like I say, when you put that together, you realize that indeed we're talking about somebody who is way over here. If he is related a second generation away from Moses, he's not way down here. Gabe? Right. Yeah, and I mean another classic one is when you get to 1 Samuel and it says Eli's sons were so wicked that they, what does the King James say? That they, does it say they cursed God? No, I think it says they brought a curse on themselves, something like that. But by just a very slight change. Because when somebody would read that, a scribe would read that, they would say, there is no way in the world a person who was a priest would curse God. I mean, that's just unheard of. But actually, with that one little change or so in the text, instead of saying they brought a curse on themselves for their behavior, it says, those boys were so bad they cursed God. And there are, like I say, multiple places in the Old Testament where those kinds of things are that it's just like, there is no way that could have been true. But it just shows how evil sin really is. It just shows what really happens. Okay? So, I don't want to belabor the point, but the definite point is to understand these verses, this evil is coming early on. Okay? Third thing I say on your sheet, to notice how the judges, their ministry was basically civil or supervisory as well as military. And for the four writers, for the four examples that the writer of Hebrews uses, every one of them is known for their military victory. Okay? God raised them up and they indeed were empowered for a task. I like how one modern writer describes them. He calls them spiritually empowered warlords. And when you kind of think of modern day what happens in the Middle East, etc., fighting, etc. Maybe that is a good term to use for them. But but ultimately, I think as we struggle with this and say, how could these individuals be called great examples of faith? We need to remember this background of Canaanization. Okay, what do we mean by Canaanization, or what do we mean? You've heard me talk before about don't be a Canaanite. Okay, I gave you some quotes here. The entire book portrays a nation rotting at the core. The people claim to be His, but behave in every respect like a Canaanite people. It's not the enemies outside who threaten the soul, but the Canaanite within. Thus, this writer says that the theme of the book is actually the Canaanization of the nation of Israel. So, let's take just a moment and let's kind of, shall we say, wrestle with or keep some things in mind and say, how in the world can these individuals that we're going to specifically look at, these judges, how in the world can we say they showed their faith? Okay? Well, I think example number one, or the first thing you can notice, this is at the bottom of page 1 on your handout. This was an incredibly evil time, as we've just noted. And so, at such drastic times, even a candlelight, if you will, or shall we say a little flashlight, can have immense help during a very dark, cloudy night. The darker the night, as somebody has said, the brighter the light. And that's true. The darker the light is, the brighter your little candle really can be. So, with this nation given over to Canaanization, any little candlelight concerning the Lord was very significant. So even when we start studying these individuals, and we say, boy, it doesn't seem like he had a 500-watt bulb there. No, maybe it was only a 25-watt bulb. But when you're talking about the incredible ungodliness, a 25-watt bulb can look pretty bright, and you've got to be pretty gutsy to go walking out with a 25-watt bulb when everything around you is total darkness. Number two, the writer of Hebrews doesn't specify what constituted their faith. So as we read the Old Testament story, the quote on your sheet, we find that each man battled against overwhelming odds, so that humanly speaking, there was little chance of his coming out on top. For men in such positions, faith in God was not a formality. It meant real trust when the odds seemed stacked against them. Another quote, the accounts in Judges focus on the courage and military exploits of these people, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson. The judges trusted in God and acted on that trust, and thereby delivered Israel from its enemies. In other words, the judges should be remembered primarily as people of faith, not as someone who disobeyed the Lord. And number three, another thing to keep in mind, perhaps the writer intended for us to take the first three phrases of verse 33 as our cue to organize our thoughts. So in other words, after he mentions these individuals, in verse 33 he says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, and obtained promises. And so maybe the writer is in effect saying, now when you think of some of these examples I used, and you're going to wonder how in the world did they exhibit faith, think of it along these three lines. Put this on your grid. First of all, they subdued kingdoms. Okay? They did, because every one of them was going against a different enemy somewhere around here. And in order to do that, they had to trust God, as we're going to see, that with their puny little army, they could go against a great Canaanite opponent and still be victorious. So they had to have faith to subdue kingdoms. Number two, they worked or practiced righteousness. Now, the Greek word that is used here in the book of Hebrews, translated righteousness, can be translated justice. And so if you have like an NIV, or I think maybe some other modern translations, it actually says they administered justice. And when you stop and think of what they were doing, that really was what they were doing. God told them to go in and defeat these peoples who had turned their back on God and were so ungodly. And that happened to be the method that God was using to bring about justice. So that's another way you could look at it. And thirdly, it says they obtained promises. Perhaps the emphasis here is God told them that they would be successful in battle if they would obey Him. And when they went out and they obeyed Him in battle, what happened? God didn't say, "Oh, shucks, you should have known better than to trust me. I was just kidding. Didn't you see my tongue was in my cheek? I didn't mean it." No. They took God at His word. They took God's promises at His word. They did what God said to do, even though it sounded kind of ridiculous. And God said, "Okay, you did really bank on me. You trusted me. I will honor your faith, and I will give you the victory," even though humanly speaking, there's no way you can explain that. So I think that's a good way to look at these judges as well. These things they did are incredible when you think of it in light of these particular things. So, when we start then, and wow, you really held me up with all your questions today, so we're not going to be able to finish the lesson we had. So, Lord willing, next Sunday we're not going to be having Sunday school because of Easter. Instead of listening to me, you can go in the gym and feast out, pig out, whatever at this time. So 2 weeks from today, Tom, remember to wear the same shirt so you bring this handout back, okay? And we will have to pick up here, and when we do, we will actually go in the order of the Old Testament chronology. I mean, if you happen to notice here, when he lists these judges, they're not in the same order they are in the Old Testament. Gideon and Barak are turned around. Actually, Barak is first and then Gideon. And then you have Samson and Jephthah. They're turned around. Actually, you have Jephthah's account and then Samson's account, which is no big deal per se. But when we do get back to it, and if you look at your sheet and say, "What's he doing here? He seems to have messed up in his outline." No, intentionally, we're going to look at them in the chronological order that they appeared to be here. But that brings us then, if you go to the back side of your sheet, because we always close out these sessions with our church history hero of the day. And our church history hero of the day is, look in a mirror, it's you. And then in parentheses I put, "I hope." Okay? Now, what in the world do I mean? Am I trying to be cutesy? Absolutely not. Since the material we looked at today, and I wish we would have gotten even more into the first two judges there, but the material we looked at today in the book of Judges shows us an incredible time of evil and this incredible canonization of these people who said, "Well, I'm a child of God." But you'd have never known it by listening to them, looking at their lifestyle, looking at the choices they made, anything of the sort. So I thought that this would be an especially good week, instead of talking about a church history hero from the past, to challenge every one of us and say, "Okay, God help me. I want to be the church history hero this week by exercising faith." A real quick aside before I explain exactly what I mean. Before we started this series, and people would come up to me and say, "Royce, what's the next series in Sunday school?" And I told them, they'd say, "Oh, that sounds neat." And I'd say, "Yeah, and we're going to be highlighting a church history figure each week." And then I would ask them, "Hey, can I use you as our church history figure one week and put you on our handout?" And everybody I asked declined and said, "No, you can't use me." I mean, even Wilson. I asked Wilson if I could use him, and he said, No, don't include me on that, okay?" But, like I say, when I started thinking of this week and the way to bring home a lesson to us, I thought, you know what? This is a good time to do it, to challenge us to be a hero. Okay? And to remember again, what does Hebrews 11:1 tell us about what makes up a hero? You have conviction or assurance that God has spoken, that what He has spoken is truth, and that you can take it to the bank and obey it. And number two, it means being able to see what you can't see. That's what made these people heroes. And that's why you can look in a mirror and say, "You know what? It is possible for me to be classified as a hero in God's book." So, when we Think of, what some of the quotes I've just said. I gave you a couple of other quotes here to lead us into this. The writer says, human heroes in the book of Judges are few and far between. The same is true, especially in the contemporary American evangelical church. No book in the Old Testament offers the modern church as telling a mirror as this book. All the marks, you might want to underline this, all the marks of Canaanite degeneracy are evident in the church and its leaders today. And as I put there, the copyright for that book is 1999. Just think how much better things have gotten from 99 until now in a quarter of a century. Yeah. And then when he explains it, trying to encourage, of course he's trying to encourage the reader that the book of Judges does have application for 21st century believers. Notice what he says, because these are the things that we need to be challenged with if we are not going to go out and be Canaanites this week. Evidences of the Canaanization of the church are everywhere. Our preoccupation with material prosperity, which turns Christianity into a fertility religion. Now, what in the world is going on there? Okay, remember, a major thing about Canaanite worship, because Canaanite worship was all about the fertility cult. It was literally, you engage in sex in a Canaanite temple with Canaanite prostitutes, and the more you do, the more you would get the gods and goddesses in heaven to engage in celestial sex, and the more they do, the more they will allow your wife to be pregnant, your cattle will bear more offspring, the land will prosper, the crops will prosper. And so as the writer does go on, I didn't give the quote here, this is nothing other than the health and wealth gospel of today. You do these things, and basically they're all sensual things, and God has to bless you. And that was literally the Canaanite culture, the Canaanite mindset. Now, do you know why God said the ban was so important when they went in? Because if you go in and you're a farmer and you just spent the last 470 years, not your life, but your ancestors, 430 down here, 40 here, and you come in and you're a farmer and you say, I ain't got any idea how to farm this land. Canaanite neighbor says, Royce, I'm glad you knocked on my door. I'll tell you how you can be a good farmer. Come with me to this high mountain place that the Old Testament refers to. And we'll go through a little religious ritual there that will guarantee the prosperity of everything for you. Oh man, this sounds better than buying fertilizer at the local farm outlet. Yes, it will help me. And next thing you know, they are immoral. They're worshiping Canaanite deities. They bought into their culture, the whole lifestyle of everything about them. Okay, dear people, if we want to be heroes, then we are going to have to not turn Christianity into a fertility religion. Second thing he mentions are syncretistic and aberrant forms of worship. Think of what's supposedly going on in so many places in our country today under the guise of worship, and it's nothing other than basically amped up Friday night honky-tonk stuff. Fleshly stuff, and basically we tell God, now this is what I'm going to do to worship you, and if you don't like it, you've got the problem, I don't, because this is how I worship. You know what? And you've heard me say this multiple times if you've been around at all. I don't find any place in the Bible where God ever goes to anybody and says, what would you like to do in worship? Let's see if we can't have a cup of coffee, a good donut together. And I think there's really not that big a difference between us. We can work out details and I can sign off on what you want to do. Absolutely no place in the Bible does God ever ask people, what would you like to do to have acceptable worship? He always says, this is acceptable worship from the top down, and now I expect you to obey me. Number 3, a refusal to obey the Lord's call to separation from the world. This goes along with all this other stuff we've been saying. Are moral compromises as a result of which Christians and non-Christians are often indistinguishable. Well, God surely loves homosexuals, so why wouldn't it be okay? And yes, we can say perverted sex of any size, shape, color, form, whatever is good. Oh, really? There's even a whole gay denomination. Not just people in denominations who have brought their denomination down, an entire gay denomination. Our reluctance to answer the Lord's call to service. Our eagerness to fight the Lord's battles with the world's resources and strategies. Our willingness to stand up and defend perpetrators of evil instead of justice. All those are signs of Canaanitism. They're all signs of caving in, kissing up to the contemporary culture. And so, dear people, as I put on the sheet, our challenge for this week is to honestly ask God and say, okay, God, I attend Kaysville Bible Church. We study the Bible, and I really want the Bible to have influence in my life. I really want the Word of God to have a bearing on my life. So we say, in what area have I become a Canaanite, and I need your help so I can be a hero in the midst of this present darkness? I mean, don't we all bemoan the terrible evil that we see around us, the incredible, totally incredible ungodliness? So we're saying, God, what kind of candle can I be this week when I think about some of these things that are mentioned right here and just take that little stand that would set me apart from people so that they know I'm a Christian? Doesn't mean you become a bull in a china shop. It's just that little candlelight that is so different, however, that in the midst of this incredible darkness we call the United States of America, it stands out, and people say there is something different about that person. Heroes, 21st century heroes. God's still writing His book. Okay, Lord bless you. Go forth with those encouraging words, huh?